Welcome back everyone. This is the first session of the third week of Angular development course. In this week, we would be understanding about what is modules and components in detail. So before proceeding any further, let's recap on what we learned in the last week. In the last week, we learned about what is Angular and what are its features. We also looked into the history of Angular, starting right from AngularJS and learning what is the latest version and what are the incremental features that were added. We also understood what is the architecture and the basic building blocks of Angular. Then we went in and dived deep into how to think in Angular. If you remember, we discussed the example of IRCTC website and we tried to break it down into individual Angular modules and components, and we tried to just mentally build a Angular application right just by looking at the wireframe of IRCTC. Next, we also looked into how to create a basic Angular application from scratch, both in your local and also on the stackblitz.com. And also we saw what is your project structures like and what are the best practices associated with it. So before going any further, I would just quickly like to recap whatever we learned last time so that the concepts are really clear in your mind. So let's get back to the whiteboard. So as you would have seen in the last week, whenever you create a new Angular application using the Angular CLI command, which is ng new and your project name, right? So this Angular CLI command creates a new project for you. A new project is created. So by default, it creates a bunch of files. So let's try to see what all it creates. So you would see over here that, it creates all this SRC folder and all your bunch of different config files, which we discussed in the last lecture, right? So inside your SRC, you have something called app wherein all your components are created, and whatever new components that you create also gets added under this, so on and so forth. And you would have seen that by default, a module is created, which is called the app module. This module can also be called as the root module because this is the core module of your application. And this is what hosts all the other app modules which you may create over the period of time. So they are now clear, what is the files and structure that is created by the Angular CLI when you create any new project. But now let's try to understand what happens behind the scene and how this gets compiled into the final project. So this is mainly for your understanding to ensure that you really understand what happens behind the scene. So let's get back to the whiteboard. So once you create any new Angular folder, like a Angular project, a bunch of files gets created for you, right? And whenever you kind of then build or deploy this project into your server, right? So maybe if you have a server called say irctc.com co.in. So what happens is Angular CLI by using there is a build tool which is used by Angular called as Webpack, WEBPACK. So this is a free build tool which is used by Angular. So what the Webpack does for you is it transpiles all this TS, HTML and CSS files for you and converts them into an optimized bundle. So the final optimized bundle would look something like this. You would have your index.html file. You would have your a main JS file which would be kind of hosting all your JS, and you would have one style.scss file which would be hosting all your styles, and there would be a bunch of other files as well like polyfills, runtime, so on and so forth, depending on the build configuration. So what happens behind the scene is whatever files that you have created or whatever structure that you have created during in your project, once it is getting deployed or bundled for the deployment, internally the Webpack plugin or the Webpack library will transpile all these TS files for you and convert them into the corresponding JS files. And whatever HTML files that you have written will also be kind of converted into the corresponding HTML or the JS code, which at the runtime would be rendered for the user in the HTML page. And all the CSS in your files would also be bundled together into a composite style.css, right? So now the next question arises is how does this Webpack work? So what happens behind the scenes? So what really happens is when you create a bunch of modules, a bunch of components, a bunch of directives, pipes, services, so on and so forth, the Webpack will individually traverse to each of these files, like each of the TypeScript files, understand what is the code written in it, and it will just create a single JavaScript file under which it will then recreate all these functions and files and variables that you have created as a block of functions or code for you. And this would be optimized in such a way there is no, in a way, there is no redundant code or there is no extra spaces or too much of blank lines, so on and so forth, because this main.js file and index.html and style.css has to be optimized for the runtime. What I mean by optimized is, let me give you a real example. So say for example, say assume like this is my code. Like if when I'm writing my code, I could give here a bunch of spaces. Like I could also give here a bunch of spaces. And similarly, in my if I go to my app dot component dot ts, I could declare here a bunch of unwanted variables. Like I could just say like something like this, so on and so forth, right? So what happens is this gets compiled and like it gets ready for the deployment in your server, right? So what the Angular CLI will do at the runtime is it will ensure that all these extra spaces, all these unwanted variables, and if you have imported any library which you are not using, all these are removed, right? That is what you call as tree shaking if you remember from the last session. So that happens in the background for you. And finally, when this gets like ready or deployed, so you just have a bunch of optimized file for you which can easily load on the browser, and it will have like quite a good performance as well. So I hope that clears your basics for now. And going ahead, let's now also understand a few other things. Also important thing that you need to understand is, because this is a common misconception among many freshers who are entering newly into the front end web development world. They think that whatever front end application that you write, so say like something like irctc.com or any of those, like it could be your Flipkart, Amazon, or whatever site, right? They think that all this HTML, CSS and JavaScript are being run at the server, and they just get displayed at the browser for you. But this is a misconception. There are two ways in which like your application can run. So one is called the server side rendering, or the other could be your client side rendering. So what is the server side rendering and what is client side rendering? So server side rendering means the first time when I load any site onto my browser, right? So what happens is, instead of building that data dynamically inside my browser when after like transferring it to my computer, the server automatically builds a static HTML page for me with all the predetermined content and just directly ships me this HTML first. And once I get this HTML first, in the background, then it will fetch the rest of the JavaScript, CSS, and the other HTML files which is required, and then dynamically like generates the other content for me as and when I kind of click on any links or scroll between the pages, so on and so forth. So this is called as server side rendering. The client side rendering concept is, what happens is, whenever I hit any website, say for example I just hit, say I have a website called as test.com, I'm just making it up. So what happens is, when I hit this test.com in my browser, it will make a request to my server which is hosting my Angular application, and this applies to any application, okay, not just Angular. So if I just kind of hit this site and it hits my server which is hosting this application, all my server will do is just check if this test.com has any valid application web files, and it will search and send this index.html back to the browser. And once this index.html is transferred to the browser, it will parse this index.html and see what are the other dependencies or the CSS files which are like imported by this index.html, and will then dynamically make a request to the server to fetch each of them one after the other. And after all of these are received, the final rendering and final like processing of all these files is happening in your local computer or in your local browser. Okay. So your server has no role to play in dynamically executing or like in rendering your application, but rather your browser would be doing all that heavy work of taking in the JavaScript, determining what to show to the user and how to place the content, so on and so forth. So this is called as client side rendering. So I hope this is clear for you. So the table of content for this week is as follows. We will have the modules, the components, the directives. We will also see about what is lazy loaded modules. We will understand what is data binding with components. Then we'll see what is the concept of property binding and event binding. And finally, we will touch upon what is the component lifecycle. So if you remember, we touched a bit about each of these parts in the previous lecture on a high level. So we will be building upon our concepts further in this week. So the primary learning objectives of this week is to understand what is modules, what is components, and what are directives, and how are they used in Angular. Next, we will also understand what is lazy loaded modules and why it is useful. And finally, we'll also understand the life cycle of an Angular component along with the property and event binding. Next, now let's start with the concepts of modules, components, and directives. So any medium and complex Angular project can be broken down into a group of modules, each containing its own mix of components, directives, pipes, services, and other utilities as required. So if you remember from the IRCTC example that we discussed yesterday, you would understand that if you take any medium to large application, we can mentally just break it down into number of screens, and inside each screens we can also again break it down into number of sections. And also like if it has any features or like any data changes or any such items, we can mentally think that this can be spinned off together as a separate component or as a separate service or as like a separate module altogether. So don't worry if you still are not able to visualize it, because we will be digging deep into it just in a few minutes. Also, you can consider a module to be a group of Angular utilities working together to achieve a particular objective of application, and also helps us to organize our code better. So to give you an example of this, if you remember, like yesterday in the IRCTC, we saw there is something like, there's a link called as promotions. So let's go back to the IRCTC website to understand this better. Yeah, so now we have opened the IRCTC website, and you can see that, we can now understand the concept of modules better. So what I mean by modules is, so modules are nothing but a group of like, components and other files which are working together to implement a particular feature or objective of the application. Say for example, this is my landing page. My landing page can be a module which just achieves the objective of showing the you quickly on how to book a ticket, or links, or like, a bunch of information on once they land on my landing page. So this can be the objective of my home module, and inside this I can again create a bunch of components, directives, pipes, services, so on and so forth, which will help me achieve this. Similarly, if I go to other links, or maybe like, if I click something like promotion, you will see there's a bunch of other links inside this. Some of these links also have a few sublinks, right? So say if I say advertise with us, you see that there are again a bunch of links or a bunch of pages which can be opened through this link. So this follows a more like a hierarchical fashion. So let's try to understand this in the whiteboard. So say assume like, as I said yesterday, so say I have a simple website which has like 5 pages or 5 sections, I would say. So how can I divide my application is, so say assume like this is my Angular application and this is my root module or my app module. So as you know, this app module is the default module which is created when you create your Angular application. But again, inside this, like, once I have my root module created, I could create 5 different modules, with each of these modules dedicated to one section or one screen of the application. So this could be for page 1, this could be for page 2, this could be for page 3, this could be for page 4, and this could be for page 5, right? And again, inside each of these modules, what I could do is I could again create a bunch of other components and other utilities which might be required inside this. So say assume like, my page 1 is all about promotions. So again, inside this, what I can do is I can create a bunch of components. So say something like I say advertise with us. And again, inside advertise, I could create a bunch of components with each saying advertisers through SMS, advertisers through website, so on and so forth, right? So similarly, for each of these, I could create a bunch of other components. As we said earlier, we could really create it in a tree fashion or a hierarchical fashion. So where what I mean by hierarchical is, you create one component, it could have like many child component. Those child component could again have like, siblings or further child components, so on and so forth. So we could compose our application in this fashion. So as we discussed now, so every Angular project has at least one core or root module called the app module, and can be extended to contain more modules which are called as feature modules as well, depending on the functionalities involved. So it's not always required that you really need to create a bunch of modules. It all depends on what is your application all about. And depending on what you require, you could have a bunch of other modules as well, depending on the functionalities that you are implementing. So at the minimum, there will be one module called the app module, which will be required. A module, you can just think it as a bucket that holds together all the other utilities and files for that particular module and loads them when called by a Angular project. So as we discussed yesterday, we could have an architecture like, wherein you don't really need to load everything in one particular module and make your application really big and monolithic. That is not really a good practice. So rather what we do is we split our application into a bunch of modules, and whenever the user is clicking on that particular screen or that particular link, we could load that module dynamically into our browser by making a network call. So what happens is that makes our application really fast and also reduces the footprint of our application, right? And also remember that the Angular modules or ng module in short, as it is called, is not same as the JavaScript module. Those conceptually, like they are same. So even in JavaScript, if you know, there is a concept of modules. So but the JavaScript modules are technically different from the Angular modules. So JavaScript modules are more like a standalone JavaScript code that can be exported as a module and imported anywhere to be used. But Angular module needs the @ng module decorator and its metadata to define it properly. So what we mean by over here is, see, JavaScript modules are just standalone JS code. So I'll give you an example. Let's go back to the whiteboard. So what I mean by JavaScript module is, like, if you just write a plain JavaScript module, okay, so just assume that, I write a JavaScript module which is called as math.js. I'm just making up the name. So which can have a bunch of functions, like, I could have something like sum a comma b. I could define a function for say like, minus a comma b, so on and so forth. So once I define this JavaScript module and I export it, so I just make it like, export default math.js. So what happens is, after I do this, I really don't need to do anything else. This math.js would be an independent JavaScript module which can be easily imported to any other JavaScript file, and I could directly start using all the functions and utilities which are defined inside this math.js. So this is what is a traditional JavaScript module. However, if you take in an Angular module, so let's get into the code of module and see how it looks. So as I said, by default, you have something called app module.ts, which gets created when you create any new project. So if you click on this app module.ts, you see that, first there is a bunch of import statement that is happening. And after that, you see there is something called as @ng module. And inside that, you see a bunch of other lines, right? You have something called declarations. You have something called import, then providers, bootstrap, so on and so forth. And finally, you see something called as export class app module, right? So what really happens over here is, in your Angular module concept, the concept of module itself is only like, defined or declared when you use this @ng module decorator. So before going further, let's try to understand what is this concept of decorators. So decorators are again a pattern which is used in software engineering. So just to give you a high level understanding of what it means. So decorator basically starts with @ and after that we define whatever the name of it is, and then we define the metadata which is associated with that particular decorator. So in simple words, a decorator is nothing but, it just gives you a bunch of metadata and functionality which will enhance your existing class function. So that's what it is at the base of it. Okay. So if you see any of the Angular file, it could be your modules or it could be your components, it could be your like, directors, pipes, whatever. You see that, all of them have this decorator. So for a module, we use something like ng module. For component, like, we have something called @component. And again, like, as we go further in the course, we'll see services, directors, pipes, so on and so forth. So for each of these, you will have their particular decorators first defined, and then we will define the metadata of that particular decorator based on like, the type of decorator it is. So if it is a component, you will see these kind of metadata which is added. If it is a module, you will see these kind of data which is added. And depending if it's some other decorator like a pipe or a service, you would see some other decorator added as well. So that is what is the concept of decorators, right? And after that, finally, you would see that, there is something called as a export class app module, and that's it. So in case of a app module, you don't really export anything inside this app module. You just simply like, define the class of app module and export it. Whereas in case of component, you would see that, what we do is like, here we define all our logic for that particular component and we are good to go. Okay. So this is what we do in terms of component, and like, if it is a module, we just kind of just export an empty class and we are done with it. And before for going any further, I want to just tell you a blueprint of how does most of the Angular files look like. So if you take any Angular file, right, it could be a component, it could be a module, it could be a pipe, it could be a service, so on and so forth. Okay. So all of these follow a particular pattern. I would say rather like, they follow like 1, 2, 3 pattern. So the first thing that they have at the top is all the import statements. So what is this import statement is basically what are the dependencies for that particular files or that particular component, module, pipe, or whatever file that you're creating. So by default, you'd be importing a few of the Angular dependencies like, @Angular core, @Angular component, yeah, whatever it may be. And also you would be importing a bunch of other components or files or pipes that you have created in your application. And there could also be cases that where you could be importing any third-party libraries as well. Say for example, you want to show a chart. So maybe you could be importing something like D3 or high charts, AM charts, so on and so forth, right? So these are the things that you do with import statements. So if you come back to our code and you see either our app module or component.ts, you would see that, there is a bunch of these import statement over here. And these follows your standard JavaScript notation. So what does this really means is import inside the curly braces ng module from @core Angular/core. So it just means that, you import this ng module interface from this particular @Angular core library. And similarly, you also import the browser module, app routing module, app component, test component, browser animation module. So in that, if you see, this test component is something that we created, but the rest of the other things are the core Angular files which are being imported, right? And so as I said, like, there are cases where like, you could also be creating your own components which has to be imported. Or there could be also be cases where you could be importing third-party libraries as well. Say for example, if you want to bring in Angular material, so on and so forth. So you have to import it here, right? Depending on the need of the application. So that is what is with the import statement. So the second part that we do over here is, it is called something the decorator part. So what we do over here is, this is where we define what is the file all about. If it's a component, we just start it with @component. If it is like, module, we say @ng module. If it is a pipe, we say @pipe. If it is a directive, we say @directive, so on and so forth. So basically what it means is, what is that file or that particular TS file that defining, like, what it is going to do. So that is what, like, you would be defining with the help of this decorator. So coming back, so as I said earlier, if it is a module, as I said, you will be defining this @ng module and then define the metadata of it. And what is a metadata? It just is the data about the data. So it just tells you, like, for this particular module, these are the declarations, these are the imports, these are the providers, and this is what you have to bootstrap. And what it means, I will tell you. So declaration basically means is, inside this particular module, I have declared, or you can say, like, I have these two components which are defined or declared in my particular module. Imports means, for this module to work properly, I need these modules to be imported into my module, right? And providers is something like, where this talks more on the dependency injection part. So for now, we have not created any services, which we discussed earlier, like, if you want to have some reusable code, like, which can be just dynamically injected. So those kind of things we define over here. Don't worry, we will be doing it in just due course of time. And bootstrap means, when my application loads for the first time, what is the component that I want to load first in my application. So that is what this bootstrap means all about. So bootstrap just means, what is the first thing that has to be loaded. Okay. And same thing, if you come to the app component.ts file, I will see that, @component, there are these three metadata. So first is a selector. Selector is nothing but, when you open your index.html file, you would see that, we have defined this custom tag over here called app-root, right? How does your application know what is this app-root all about? So what it will do is, it will scan through this selector over here, and it will see that, it has given the name of app-root. So due to this, what happens is, your application, whenever it encounters, like your Angular compiler, whenever it encounters this app-root, it will directly then substitute whatever code is written inside this component and replace it over there. So that is what this selector is all about. Then template URL is nothing but, as I said earlier, right, every component has to be associated with the HTML. So here we are defining what is the HTML file to which it is associated with. So as a best practice, there are two ways to do it. Either you can directly define the HTML over here. So instead of using template URL, what you can do is, I'll just show you the other way of doing it. So assume, like, I just can give template, and I can just define, like, the HTML part directly over here. So I can just say, I'll just, for the sake of it, I will type something. Okay, I have just commented out the URL and I have just given template. So in this case, I missed the comma. Yeah. So in this case, now you can see that, whatever we defined over here is being picked up by our component instead of the URL. So there are two ways of defining the HTML. Either you can directly define it inside a template, or you can use the template URL to define which HTML is being linked up with this component. So as a best practice, what we do is, whenever we create a component, along with that, an HTML file, a CSS file, a spec file, and a TS file gets created by default by your Angular CLI. So what is the spec file is, as I said yesterday, this is more about how can we unit test our component that you have written. So what it does is, so basically, like, if I create my, like, my any component, so there are a few basic tests which is already given by your Angular CLI, but the due course of time in the future sections, we would like explore on how to write unit test cases as well. For now, you can skip this part, but we will focus more on the components and the structure of the any Angular file for now, right? So I'm just reverting it back. Yeah. So coming back, so now you can see that, whatever we gave earlier, that ABCD in the previous session, so that is back now. Yeah. So coming back, now we understood, like, your any Angular file would have three parts. So one is your import, second is your decorator, and third is nothing but your class declaration, right? So where you define whatever you want. So if it is a component, you would define like any variables, any functions, or any other API calls, or whatever you want to do. If it is a pipe, then, like, you define what is the transformation logic that you want to apply. If it is a module, you normally don't define anything in the module, you just leave it blank. So if it is say some services, you define what are the functions or what are the variables which is required, so on and so forth. So I hope now you're clear, like, if you look at any Angular file, what are the things that you would see. So first, as I said, would be the import. You would see a list of import that is happening. Second would be the decorator, so which defines what is that Angular file all about. And third would be the class, where you define the logic of your that particular file, right? So this is what is the structure of any Angular file looks like. So coming back, So now I hope you're clear, like, what is the difference between a JavaScript modules, Angular module, and how does any of these files look like, so on and so forth. So we have now seen the demo of modules. So again, let's go back and understand, like, what is the modules all about. So as I said, I'm repeating it again and again just to ensure that, it really stays in your mind. So when your Angular application is created by default, you have a root module called the app module.ts. So this is the base for your application, which will host and also load any other modules dynamically as you click on them. So either you can define the entire logic of your application in this app module and app component itself, which is not a good practice. Or what you can do is you can also create a bunch of other modules along with this app module, which will be handling one particular screen or one particular functionality of your application. And whenever the user clicks on that particular link or that particular functionality, then you load that module dynamically. So that is called as lazy loading. Okay. And as I said earlier, your module has a decorator called as ng module, inside which you declare these four items. Declaration, as I said, these are the components which you create inside this modules and which is like kind of like declared inside this module. Imports means that these are the other third party modules both within your application and any other third party libraries which you use, which are required for this particular module to run properly. Providers is basically for the services or the dependency injection. Currently we don't have any, but in the future we'll be creating it. And bootstrap means that when this module is loaded, what is the default component that has to be rendered or loaded. So that is what this bootstrap means, right? And as I said earlier, normally in your app module class, we normally don't write any logic or business function over here. So that's why it is left blank over here. So I hope with that you're clear on like, what is basic project structure looks like, what is modules, what is like on a high level, how do you like, define any Angular file, what are the parts of it, and these stuff. So with that, we have come to the end of the first session, and I'm looking forward to meet you all in the next session. Thank you.